Apparently, though, I'm in the minority in a number of ways, including church affiliation. The latest census data released last week says that there are officially more people who say, I have no religious affiliation than people who have some type of faith or some type of connection with a church in particular. Joining me on the program now is Communications Director for the Baptist Churches of New Zealand, Dr. Mike Crudge. Mike, kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time today.
Kia ora, Andrew. Nice to be here.
It's difficult to spin this as good news, of course, if less a slightly smaller percentage of the population are saying that faith is important to us. It's been a steady downward decline, but what does the census data actually show us, Mike?
Yeah, so what we're talking about in the decline is what's called Christian affiliation. Mm-hmm. And so that's been declining for decades now, probably as long as I've been living. And that 150 years ago, that was about 95% of the population would have ticked Christian affiliation. And so now it's dropped down to 32% of the population say that. Now, I think we need to distinguish between affiliation and actually following Jesus, who are Christian and who are just affiliating with Christians. So I've got a little analogy that kind of works. I think if you're a rugby head, you might follow or affiliate yourself with a particular team, might be the Crusaders or the Hurricanes, right? Yep. And you buy season tickets and you watch all the games on TV. You don't actually play rugby. So you're watching, I don't know, how many people is it that play on the rugby team? Yeah. And so there are New Zealanders who actually play rugby. And so I looked it up. There's under 4% of our population play social rugby or competitive in their regions. Yeah. But nearly 48% are watching the rugby games on TV. And so that's the difference between kind of like there's this Christian affiliation are those that may have these days have a historical connection to some Christian heritage. Yep. And then there's those that like yourself, you're attending a church regularly, you're part of a faith community, you're following Jesus. So I think there's a difference there. And so the curve that is dropping, I think, is a correction. And eventually that Christian affiliation, it'll only be people that are following Jesus that will tick that box.
I suppose it's becoming countercultural in New Zealand to be a Christian, and that may be good news because cultural Christianity, the danger of that is that it's difficult to evangelize people who think they're already Christians. Whereas if there is more of a cultural difference between people who have a genuine faith in Jesus and people who just say, oh, my gran went to church, so I suppose I'm Presbyterian, for example, that may be good news for the church.
I think it's really good. Like, there's probably been no better time than now in New Zealand to be talking about spirituality. And for us that are following Jesus, we have a special kind of spirituality, Christian spirituality. And so yeah, I think it's possibly easier, as you say, because people aren't thinking they're Christian and ticking that Christian affiliation box. People are ticking no religion, and that's great. We can talk to them about spirituality. And so a pop quiz I like doing is asking, when did church attendance, which is a one way to measure following Jesus, but when did church attendance peak in New Zealand?
I would guess the 1950s, but I also suspect that I'm wrong.
Yeah, so most people would say that, sort of the middle of last century. It was actually the century before.
Wow.
So 1890s, church attendance peaked in New Zealand, and that was around 30% of the population. So that's the peak. And now today we're probably sitting around 10%, 10 to 15% maybe. Because we know not everybody who is following Jesus are part of church communities, but 10 to 15%. So we are a minority, a strong minority, but it's not like... In the 1890s, 30% were going to church, 95% around that were ticking Christian affiliation.
Wow.
So you can see the difference between the watching, that rugby analogy. It's the players on the team, those are the followers of Jesus. Yeah. And I'd actually suggest, let's, as a local church, looking at this data, or local churches, what's a better way to measure the following of Jesus than church attendance?
Because not everyone that goes to church is a Christian. Some people do so for cultural reasons. That is very much the case. There's a difference between hanging around the changing rooms, lacing your boots on, and running onto the field, right?
Yeah, exactly. And those that have that cultural connection. So my guess is it's probably older people. And so if we take retired people, say someone who's turning 75 next year,
Yeah.
they were born in 1950. And we know that a lot of our socialization into life is from our parents or our household. And so we are socialized as citizens of a country largely through our experience in the home as children growing up in there. So the people that are turning 75 next year, their parents were born 25 or 30 years before they were. So that's 100 years ago.
Wow.
So the influence that was shaping them is so much different to the influence that is shaping someone who's born today, whose parents might have been born 20 years ago, say 2005. Just the whole world is a different place now. And there's not that Christian framework that would have been around 100 years ago in New Zealand.
How should the church respond to this? Because secular media can have a bunch of fun going, see, I told you. What a bunch of nonsense. Nobody believes in that anymore. But actually, some church communities are thriving. Some churches having the opposite problem. Gosh, we don't have enough room for our Sunday school anymore. How do you think the church should respond to statistics that can be painted in a negative light, Mike?
Yeah, so I think the distinguishing between the Christian affiliation and the actual what is the church, and we could talk more about how to define that. But in the first case, knowing the differences of the two. So we've got 10 to 15% of people that are participating in Christian faith community in the churches. So that's a massive amount, like compared to our population. So there's 500,000 New Zealanders around that are followers of Jesus. That's a huge amount. So I think we should embrace that and know that while the affiliation line in the graph it's not plummeting, but it's gradually going down year after year after year. So it's at 32% this time. In 5 years' time, it'll be even lower until, like, my opinion is it'll bottom out and it'll at that actual 10 to 15% mark. And we'll see it'll only be followers of Jesus who tick that Christian box. So what we could do in the meantime, how do we be great followers of Jesus as the church, as local churches, and start perhaps measuring the transformation that is occurring because I follow Jesus, because I'm part of a community of faith that is following Jesus. What transformation is happening, rather than just attendance on a Sunday morning to hear you preach this week?
General transformational change, or another way of looking at building the kingdom of God. I mean, this is perhaps a better way to measure things than even bums on seats on a Sunday morning, or people that tick Christian or Jedi Knight in the census every 4 years, right?
And the problem is we might not actually be that good when we start looking at different ways to measure how we're following Jesus. And so for example, when we're following Jesus, when you follow a leader, you tend to learn what the leader does and do what the leader does, or how they teach. And so we have this word discipleship as Christians, right? And so we're learning to be more like Jesus. And one example that we could use to measure how we're doing in that following of Jesus is, when he started his public ministry, in Luke chapter 4, he's opening the scroll of Isaiah when it's handed to him, and he basically says, "This is what I've come for." And there's a bullet list of things: good news to the poor, released captives, sight recovery, freedom from oppression, proclaiming the Lord's favor. So those things could be the way we measure how we're following Jesus. So for example, good news to the poor. There's this thing called the deprivation index in New Zealand, and it measures things that situate people, or it describes the situations that people might be finding themselves in, depending on their wealth. So one example is one of the questions in answering this: and looking at your own home, do you have mold on the walls bigger than the size of an A4 piece of paper? Now, to me, that is like a crazy thing to think about. If my house was growing mold like that, I'd be worried. But there are people living in houses that are moldy enough to have that as a question in this index. Now, the good news to the poor who are living in that kind of situation is that their children aren't getting respiratory diseases and missing school, having to go to the doctor, or even having to go to hospital because they're living in an unhealthy home. Now, at the moment, we tend to leave those discussions to politicians about the standard of the houses we live in. But imagine if the church was leading the way, being the greatest advocate in that particular example, or actually figuring out, how do we make people in our neighborhood have healthy homes? What if every person in our neighborhood had a healthy home? That would be a great measure to indicate the following of Jesus.
Or even impacting such things as homelessness or loneliness or a sense of connection and community where churches are involved. I love this point, Mike, because it says the church's influence on society isn't locked into the proportion of people who say they're a Christian or turn up to church. The sphere of influence is in the way in which we love one another, in the way in which we build the kingdom of God in our communities. And usually, when we look back at church history, that's usually been in a minority situation, a small group of people having a disproportionately positive influence on the society that they are a part of. That's what we've seen in the past. We could see that again.
Yep. Yeah, and I hope so.
Well, Mike, on that optimistic note, we'll wrap things up. Certainly appreciate the work that you do with the Baptist team there. Thanks so much for your comments. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.